Fortunately, we have two primary barns here that are very, very similar forms known as English barns. One predates the other by probably 40 years, 45 years. So this barn here, the primary barn here, dates to about the 1880s, we think. And then the newer model around the other side where you can't see it is around 1925. And so one of the things that we're asked to do a lot is to come to visit, do site visits for people. And one of the questions they always ask is, how do I know how old this barn is? And then the next thing they usually ask is, how do I know what it needs? We want to fix it up, we want to take care of it. We may or may not want to put it back into farm use, but we don't want to see it disappear. And of course, as you know from traveling the countryside, barns can be in near fatal condition and they can be in relatively good condition. So I'm going to talk about history and the differences between these barns, which should give you some insight into how you date these kinds of structures from certain things that we refer to as telltales or signs that they embody, and then also show you the distinctions between the two of them, and at the same time try to give you some idea of how to approach a condition analysis of a building, barns in particular. The nice thing about barns is that they're all visible. So you don't have drywall covering up all the electricity. You don't have interior pockets of space. The worst thing about, in that regard, the thing that's difficult is you usually have an upstairs and a downstairs, and sometimes the loft areas, which were primarily used for hay storage, are closed off from down below. So it's not always easy to interpret the framework of the building without going upstairs. And in these two barns, we can't go upstairs. So the floors aren't in good enough condition and the ladders are precarious, and that's just not safe to do. So I will try to interpret for you as best I can. So I gave you these sheets because if you look at the top page, on most of you it's the top page anyway, the one of the three-dimensional framework, that's a very typical English barn framework that has been in existence probably since the 1500s and possibly earlier in Scotland and England. It's a timber framework, which basically means that these are sawn or hewn beams put together by hand in mortise and tenon joints and pegged with what are called pegs and what are officially called trunnels, and you'll see that in both these barns. You will also see a hand-hewn barn, primarily a hand-hewn barn, versus one that's a sawn barn. And the difference there in time is essentially that, as you can suspect, sawmills came along at a certain point and were actually able to handle large tree trunks. And before that, even though there were sawmills as early as the 1840s in Indiana, they couldn't saw a 60-foot beam. They could saw 9 feet. So anything bigger than that had to be shaped by hand. That's a reason that you will see hand-hewn beams in a barn alongside sawn beams that are smaller, or braces that are smaller, other pieces. So you always have to realize that, like us, as time goes by, these buildings change, and the way they started out isn't always the way they end up. And so you have to be able to sort of look at these telltales and say, well, wait a minute, that can't be 1880, you know. Maybe not. Maybe somebody came in 1960 and replaced a beam. So I'll try to point that stuff out. From the condition standpoint, think about looking from the bottom up, okay? A building, any building, won't stand if it's not on a good foundation. And so when I go to look at a barn, I stand back and try to appraise the entire building. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk up into this space and look at the far barn. And I just want you to just sort of sight the barn. Just tell yourself, is this building standing straight, okay? If it isn't, you have to start to look at the foundation right away, okay? So you may see a crooked roof, but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the roof, okay? So you want to start at the bottom up and work your way up visually, and we'll just talk about that as we get closer, and then we get inside, I'll show you also. So what you're actually looking at is a way to figure out if it's structurally sound, And this framework that you're looking at in these pictures is the structure. So those pieces need to be sound, and you may have 90% of them may be good and the other 10% aren't, and that could be fatal in certain buildings. So let's just walk into this space and have a look and see if these barns are straight. I look at it and say, is that building sitting straight? So you look at the ridge, which is the top line of the roof. You look at the corners, sometimes door openings, and you just have to establish in your own mind if you think that's straight or not. Now, I was a carpenter for years and years and years, and so I know it took me 10 years to see square or see level, okay? Now I can kind of do it, but I know that not everybody can do it. But this barn is very sound in terms of its standing straight. I mean, the vertical siding is good, the corners are good, they're not sunken, the roof isn't swayed, the building isn't leaning to the left or the right, which is common. So you have to assume that this foundation is pretty sound. Now that doesn't mean it doesn't need any repair, okay? So then the next thing I do is just sort of walk around it. You can walk through this barn and see the other side or just see the ends of it, but it's so visible, I'm just gonna do it from here for you. This is actually a foundation of concrete block. It's concrete block that's not bought at the lumber yard. It's concrete block that's made in the field, okay? Concrete block that is handmade, it was made in concrete block forms, or machines, they called them, which were really just hand forms, the thing that looked like a little table. You poured concrete and aggregate into it, you mixed it yourself, you made one block at a time, or if you were lucky, your sons made it, or your daughters made it. And it's rough, okay? The concrete at the time wasn't great. People weren't expert at doing it. The machines weren't perfect. An advanced concrete block machine made 3 at a time, okay? So it didn't get a lot better. So when you see concrete block in individual blocks, and it's got a real rough texture and a very uneven edges, it's almost always handmade block, okay? Concrete starts to be used in Chicago in the high-rise buildings and as floating foundations in the 1870s and 80s. Before that, we have a cement of a type, goes all the way back to Rome, which was mostly made from lava stone and sand and lime, okay? But concrete as we know it doesn't start until the late 19th century and gets better and better very quickly.
I have a picture of that. I just think
Out of nowhere, we have a picture of a concrete block form machine. Wow, that's great. It's called the Wizard, automatic action, but you can see it's not all that automatic. So anyway, that's a telltale for time. Okay, so this foundation's pretty early, and before this, foundations were mostly stone piers, which means individual stones on the corners and along the eave sides. This is the eave side, by the way, and the ends are the gable sides, gable ends. So these barns would have been built on piers. They would have been put under the primary posts, which we'll see when we get inside. And they basically dug a very deep hole, usually put gravel or some kind of aggregate in it, put stones down about 2, 3, 4 feet deep, and piled them up and brought them out of the ground and built the barn on top of it. And you see that all the time. They're still common. They tended to last a long time. And after that, you start to see this. So we're talking about the first 20 years of the 20th century, we're beyond stone piers. Okay, they're starting to build solid foundations now. Okay, so I want to just walk inside, and I want you to just sort of look at the ends and familiarize yourself with the building, and then we'll just sort of meet right there in the main aisleway, and we'll talk about the type of barn it is. So this is an English barn, and the definitive characteristic of an English barn is a through aisle, also called a threshing aisle, which goes from eave side to eave side. And the purpose of it was, and almost certainly this barn had a dirt floor in it originally, and then it would have had wood plank on top of that. And the purpose of the English barn was almost exclusively for the storage of grain when they were originally built. So basically wheat. So we're talking about England, Scotland, Ireland. And you cut your wheat by hand in the field, you put it in a wagon, you hooked up the team, you pulled the wagon in on the threshing floor, you dumped the wheat onto the floor, and you flailed it and knocked the wheat berries off, and that was your crop. And then you drove the wagon on. You drove your wagon on out. When you flailed the wheat, both doors created what's called, created a draft, the so-called breezeway, and that breeze helped blow the chaff out of the barn, and the heavier seed would settle. The word threshold derives from a removable board that they put across each doorway when they dumped the wheat, so that when the wind took the chaff out, it wouldn't blow the wheat berries out into the yard. That's where the word threshold comes from. Threshing hold, right? So that was the original. That's why this barn was designed the way it was. It was also known as a 3-bay barn, and a bay is the space between the structural component. So this is a bay. There's a bay over there where you were, they used as a milking stanchion, and then there's a storage bay over here. So 3 bays, that's the original barn. As these barns mature and the same style is built because of its cultural link to whoever's building it, and they needed bigger ones, they just continued to add bays. And so you might have a barn that starts out as a 30 by 40 and ends up as a 30 by 90. You just keep adding bays. It was quite convenient, as long as you could go long ways. The downside of that is the aisle couldn't move and couldn't expand. It was always going to be somewhere near the middle or near one end. Barns that have their aisles that run transversely from one end to the other, when they add on to them, the aisle just keeps getting longer and longer. And that is the so-called modern barn, because that was much more adaptable for larger farms. So as farms became mechanized and larger, that so-called transverse frame barn, it evolves into what's called the Midwestern barn, the 3-portal barn, and you see them all the way to California, after the Midwest. So, but the English barn is still being built today in some form. The earliest ones are single-story, don't have a hayloft, just have grain bins and a threshing floor. So this is later. They adapted the style from the first barn they built here, but they used this one differently. So they have milking stanchions over on that side where they had a small dairy operation, and this side we think was used primarily for storage. In a very early example, you might have a team of horses or a milk cow. You might store them, you might stable them on one side in one bay, and then use all the other side for grain storage. Grain storage was always in a tight box, so to keep out rats, basically. And you'll see when we get to the other barn, I'll show you there's a grain bin over there, and there is not one in this barn. So the structure of this barn is a series of bents. There are 4 bents, and if you look at the second sheet there, you'll see a diagram of what a single English barn bent looks like, and these are pretty close to that. So you have 1 on each end and 2 in the middle, which creates 3 bay spaces. The difference is that in this barn, and you can't really, I'm sorry, you can't really see upstairs very well, that bent, the top part of that bent, can I borrow this from you for a second? This so-called collar tie section in the middle, which is also shows on the other seat, they did not build in the middle 2 bents. The reason they didn't is they didn't want any structure up there to make it difficult to put in hay. So they just went straight up from there on the outer edges and left an opening. And that's another sign of a newer barn. Okay, the older barns were structurally impaired by all the bents that went all the way up. And the bigger they were, the more structure there was, and the harder it was to adapt them for hay storage. When they start to make barns for storing hay, they open up that framework. And there's a whole series of, this example is a so-called queen post example, where the bents go up and form a box. And sometimes it's called a box frame. There's also a king post where there's a single post that goes up and supports it. So there's a whole lot of different ways these could be framed. But the traditional way to frame an English barn was with queen post, which is what this actually is. And you can see it if you look at the ends. And from here, if you come to my side, you can see the far bent at the very top of it, there's a kind of a boxed H form, which is the queen post configuration. That holds the roof up. And if you look at your diagram, there are long beams that go the length of the barn that hold the roof up at mid-rafter. Those are called purlin beams. And that's what's supporting the roof at the mid-span, in other words, in the middle of the rafter. The rafters rest on the outside walls and then are supported mid-span also. And that's a really, for an explication of how an English barn works and how they're built, this one's really pretty typical. So we're kind of lucky in the way as they get newer and newer, the variations get more and more complex. But this was intended for hay, unlike the original grain storage English barn. So it has a much higher wall and a much more open space upstairs, but it's still under a gable roof. It's not gambreled, it's not domed. So it's still a sort of limited hay barn, which means that it was a relatively small operation. Okay, they're not running 1,000 cows through here. They're running maybe 20. So, and then the dairy operation we know was fairly small. So, if you have any questions about the structural stuff?
Duncan, I just wanted to point out something that dawned on me, and I'm sure you thought of it years ago. In talking to some people, I talked about the size of the beams. Now this is a small barn, I'd guess 30 feet. But some of the big barns are 60 to 90 feet long, and that beam is one log.
Yeah.
And environmentalists need to appreciate heritage barns, in my opinion, because you can't go out to any of the forests I know of today and find a 90-foot tree to cut a 90-foot beam out of. And so they are truly illustrations of how big the trees were when we settled this state. And it had never dawned on me that that was one of the great reasons for saving heritage barns.
Yeah, I took a barn down and moved it. I took it down in South Bend years ago and moved it to Monroe County for somebody who was stabling horses. And the purlin beams were 90 feet long, single piece. And we got everything down by hand, rope and tackle, block and tackle, except those, and we had to call a crane to come in and take them off because there was just no way we could handle them. Making me think, how did they get them up there? By block and tackle, that's how they did it.
They built a frame and, took them up.
Yeah, there's a whole network they would build to put them up.
Actually, this one here, this is 34 by 44.
Yeah, so 30 by 40, they're sometimes called 30 by 40 barns.
That's right. The original one is exactly 30 by 40.
There you go.
To your point is that you made this a little bigger 20 years later.
Yeah. And this, I don't know if you noticed, but the loft floors are basically right here at the top of the wall, except for in the middle where it's elevated. It's another 4 feet up. That's so you can come in here with a wagon full of whatever, okay? So there's always, not always, but typically an elevated center section, which also would be used for storing hay, but gave you enough headspace in here that you could come in with a full wagon of hay or wheat or whatever it was you were moving through.
A couple of questions.
Yeah.
What type of wood normally are the beams?
They're normally, in Indiana, they're very typically poplar, but as the farther north you get, the more you see oak. And so some of these are, I noticed in the other barns, some of them are oak and some of them are poplar. And
Mine are all beech.
yeah,
In southern Indiana.
it's kind of like, what did you have on the farm if you were cutting your own timber?
We couldn't drive nails in there. But some places, especially northern Indiana, even walnut, right?
Walnut, yeah. I was going to say at Conner Prairie, if you've ever been in the barn at Conner Prairie, they have what's called a summer beam, which is a beam that runs the entire length of the barn just above our headspace. And that's a somewhat unusual construction. That's quite an old barn. And that log is, I think, 65 feet long, and it's solid walnut. And it's still got the bark on it, and it's big. Yeah.
That's why I know ours are beech, because there's still bark on them.
Yeah. And
When he mentions hay storage, for some of you who are younger, first of all, you think of hay nowadays, these big round bales or big square bales. Well, and then the ones that are a little older, you think of the small square bales, rectangular bales. These barns were built for loose hay.
Yeah.
And there is a track and forks, and you'll see some rope hanging down there, and you would bring loose hay, and you would grapple it with those forks, take it up, and then there'd be a team on the other end, and it would pull it. You'd tell them when to stop. If you didn't, you pulled the end of the barn out. But it always had a stop on it anyway. You took it where you wanted, and then you loosened it, and you moved it to each side with forks.
Yeah.
So
In this barn,
it's actually built for loose hay.
yeah. And in this barn, it was loaded from the outside and brought in, but in some barns, it was actually loaded from the inside as well. So when it's, sorry.
Second question, these two are wide open now. Was there a hayloft floor all the way across?
No. The hay loft is, there's one on that side, and there's one on this side, and there's one above us.
Oh, it's right here.
Yeah. I'm sorry you can't climb up in there, but
It pulls ventilation through.
yeah, yeah. And
It also made it easy to throw the hay in if you were doing it by hand.
if you came off the wagon, you could load this way. Okay.
They were using loose hay up to 2000, so I personally shoveled, loose hay out of each, but they had baled hay in the middle here. So they're probably
Interesting.
15-year-old loose hay on each side that we ended up.
When did the baling start? In the early 1900s?
Boy, when does square bales start?
Well, there were stationary, Randy, I don't know if you know, at the Indiana State Fair in Pioneer Village, and I can't remember, I think the first stationary, you didn't pull them through the field, you brought the hay in and baled it but the square bales, the small square bales that we think of, I think those were like in the teens, probably about World War I think.
Okay.
And then just a few years after that, they put wheels on it and started taking it through the field. So.
Started baling it in the field.
Those original bales that he talked about, they were done by hand. And that you had two pieces of board that looked a little bit like this. And men actually, I don't think there were very many women that would do it, wired them together to tie it. Because there really wasn't a great way to tie it. And I still have the boards from our original bale, but that is a strange thing.
The invention of the knotter was amazing.
Oh,
Yeah.
The guy who invented that made a fortune. Made a fortune. And of course you had wire knotters, and then you had string knotters. I'm sorry, I'm not talking well this morning. You had both, but the guy that invented that knotter, my dad used to talk about him. They studied him when he studied ag in the 30s. The guy that did that, he was a very brilliant man. It's a very complicated system. If you've ever worked on a baler, they're very complicated.
Yeah, yeah. When they break down in the field, you're sunk. Any other questions about this barn? The siding and so on, these barns are frequently, I have a barn very similar to this that was a Civil War era, and it's completely open. So, it's not sheathed off. This is plywood, clearly. This is later. But even the planking and stuff is almost certainly put in later when they started milking stanchion, and the concrete also would have come in at that time.
I didn't exactly understand what the fence was for. It almost looks like it was half converted for pigs.
I think
here at one time.
Okay, that's
I
what
think that's
was.
it, Lou.
Yeah, because the metal stanchions would have been open all the way to the back.
Yeah.
So that you could have brought the cows in, put them in the stanchions and milk them. But they've got pig fence on there.
Yeah, we had sheep, llamas, pigs,
There you go.
cattle, hogs, many items out here. 3 different types of birds.
It also allowed you to put a wide cart through there
Yeah.
for cleaning out
Yeah.
the manure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So originally this was a dirt floor with wood planking?
It would have had a wood floor
Threshing floor?
in here, yeah, for threshing. Yeah, not
And
concrete.
so they poured this concrete?
Probably when they started a milking operation, because of sanitation requirements, that's when you start to see concrete floors come in. Sometimes like the concrete, the feeding chute and stuff, you'll see it just on the dairy side. And then usually there's a milk house, which in this case is actually in the farmhouse, where the milk was taken and put in vats and so on. But frequently that would have been a masonry building built onto the edge of the barn where the processing took place. And then the Board of Health would make sure you kept that sanitary, right? Because that milk was either going to a local creamery or was going directly to the customer. So instead of Kroger's.
Initially, you started talking about the condition of the barn outside. How would you rate this barn? Is it like
Excellent.
8 out of 10?
I would rate it excellent. Yeah. Now I'm going to walk you in there and show you some stuff to be looking for because one of the things in a barn that has a loft floor in it is one of the things that you need to understand is hay bales and unbaled hay is very, very heavy when it comes out of the field. It's basically dry, not 100% dry, which is why the barns have to be well ventilated, but it's dry enough that it won't combust, and but it's extremely heavy. Okay, so if any of you have thrown around 75-pound hay bales, the square bales, you know that when you put 1,000 of them in a barn, you got a lot of weight. Almost to the barn, they're somewhat underbuilt in their floor systems. The timber structure is enough to carry all that weight without any problem, but frequently the floors and floor joist systems are inadequate, or they were just plain overloaded. But
the loose hay was not that heavy.
Not,
they built them, that's the key.
Right.
It was not a problem.
Right, not as heavy, yeah. But, and then of course you wanted to get that last bale in, of course, too. So if you, I'm just going to let you do this on your own. Just you can walk in there and look at the joist system through that floor, and you'll see a whole series of ones that are cracked, where where the bowing from the weight of the hay has just started to crack them. And in the newer barns, you'll frequently see those joists. They start out at somewhere around 20 inches apart, and they get down to about 12 or 8 inches, and the joists get bigger, deeper and deeper in order to carry the weight in the newer barns. But in this barn, that's the only thing I've really noticed that is structurally a problem. And the floors up there, we know this barn, it's got a new roof on it from MapleLawn's put a new roof on it, but it had leaked, and so the floor upstairs isn't really safe to walk on. I mean, there are places where it's fine, but a lot of it's not. And that's just from water entrainment into the floor system. So, and that's if you ever have the misfortune to be a barn site inspector, you have to be really careful about walking around in a loft, especially if there's loose hay on it, because you really can't tell if it's safe or not. And I have taken in the back of my truck just a big sheet of plywood with me, and I throw it up there and walk around on it because I can't tell if it's going to be safe or not. If they're cleaned off, you can usually tell. Then this is a drive-through corn crib, and it's used almost exclusively, probably exclusively for the drying of ear corn, and you could drive through it on the wagon the same way you could in the threshing barn. You bring the wagon in, there are hatches up here. You put a series of boards in the doorways to block them off. Right there where Kent is standing, you can see those slots for.
They're angled, so
yeah,
you can slip them out.
So you can slip them out, and you load the crib as high as you can through the hatches, right directly off the wagon, and then when you take the corn out for feed, you can take the slats out of the door and take out the amount that you need. Kent and I just had some communication about the relationship of corn cribs to barn derivation and so on, because there's a whole series of barns called crib barns. Cribs in barn language means room. So corn cribs are rooms for corn, okay? And crib barns were also used for other things, and there's a style called a crib barn and a transverse crib barn and so on and so on. They are, according to the historians, not related, although it's a little bit hard to believe that they're not at least related at sideways. But anyway, I just wanted to show you, this is a really good classic example of a drive-through corn crib, and like the drive-through threshing barn, clearly is somehow derivative. I mean, because corn wasn't cribbed on the ear until long after the English barn was built. Okay, so corn was basically stacked in the field and tied, And if you had a fairly small animal operation, you just went out to the field and took the corn you needed over the winter, and you left it in the field all year. Once they started animal raising as a commercial enterprise and had bigger herds and so on, then they needed more corn and they started to crib it. So this is a fairly late development in barn history, late 19th century, mid to late 19th century. So this barn is exactly the same layout. It's slightly smaller, it's earlier, it's got a full loft across instead of the raised loft in the middle, but the walls are slightly higher in here. So this is the threshing aisle again. Behind you to my right is the grain bin, which is a tight tongue and groove board bin with slatted doorways that you could let the grain down slowly as you unloaded it. And we don't really know, I don't know exactly how all this was used. This side was for feeding, probably for cattle, these slatted bays you see for loading feed in. It also had a full loft, and it's got basically the same bent structure as the other barn, except these primary bents are almost all hewn. So this is the hewn beam.
Hey Duncan, we've got a collection of these over here.
Oh yeah. This is an adze. Adze are used for the final shaping of the hewn beam. You use a broad axe, which is a big, wide, broad head, to make a lateral cut across these beams, and then you adze off, you chip them out this way. It's very, very difficult to do. I don't know if you can see it, but the axe is offset to one side of the handle. That's so you can bring it right up alongside this side, alongside the beam without cutting your leg off. Yeah, I've tried to do this. It's not easy. So the primary posts are hewn. These cross girts, I'm not completely sure that these weren't added later, but it looks like there's a new beam that's been put in over on this side. But if you remember, I was talking about how the longer posts had to be hewn because the sawmill carriages weren't big enough to saw them, and so these tall posts run through the floor and on up higher. The only way you can really see where they go is right here, which you're welcome to do. And these smaller sawn posts were manageable in sawmills. So, like as I said, we start seeing circular sawmills in the 1840s in Indiana, 1845 actually. So you'll start to get mixed pieces where the smaller members are sawn, the joists, the bracing, and things like that. In the very old barns, and there are very few left, all these components would either be poles or logs, or also would be hewn. You don't see very many of those anymore at all. But the configuration is exactly the same for this style barn. The bent goes through the floor and tops off at mid-floor, whereas the newer barn, it tops off right below the floor. So actually, if you're up there loading hay, you have to cross over the framework as the bents pass through, which was, not so bad with loose hay, but when you're throwing bales around, it was a little bit more difficult to do. But otherwise, it's basically the same. Of course, the pavilion here is added later. There's a whole other machine shed that's added later, and you should go see it. There's some great old tractors and stuff in there. But that's really the difference between these barns. But what's interesting is how culturally, and this sort of alludes to what Lou was talking about, and the English and the Germans and so on, these barns start to be built at the earliest stages of colonial development in the United States. They're brought directly in by the earliest settlers. Their cultural power is so great that they've lasted for hundreds of years as a form. We're still building barns in essentially this form because they work, basically. And so, just to see how generation after generation would continue to pass that information and knowledge along and then adapt them for new uses is a pretty interesting part of the agriculture story.